My name is Pascal Bouvier. I'm a venture capital investor. One of the areas that I look very closely into, and that I will over the next 7 years, is the identity space. And I'm very excited to moderate this panel on investing in the identity space. Given that I think I heard several people saying, "Oh my gosh, the identity space is so boring," and at least there's a conference that is making it sexy again. Imagine a subject matter that is boring, and then we're talking about investors that are interested in this. So it's probably a derivative of boring. Without further ado, let me introduce by first name each of the contestants for this challenge today, and then they'll introduce themselves very quickly. I have Andi, Xiaochen. I hope that I don't butcher your name. David, that's easy, and Jay. If you could introduce yourself and what you do, and that'd be great.
Andi Dervishi. I'm a venture capitalist like Pascal, a venture capitalist. I work for International Finance Corporation. I lead their practice in financial technology, or FinTech. And the paths between finance and identity have been tied by regulation together for quite some time. It looks like they will be tied permanently in the future. So I'm interested in identity in that aspect.
Yeah, my name is Xiaochen Zhang, and I'm the president of FinTech for Good. And we basically just identify the best blockchain FinTech technology from around the world and bring them to new markets. And for the very recently that we are going to launch two programs. One is blockchain for SDG. SDG stands for Sustainable Development Goals Influencer Project, and the other is Blockchain Acceleration Network. And if you are, part of this ecosystem, and come to find me. Yeah, thank you.
So I'm Dave Fields. I'm a founder of PTB Ventures. So PTB actually stands for Project Trillion Billion, which is this notion that the digital industrial revolution is a transformation that will see trillions of network devices connected to billions of people. And one of the primary enablers of this connectivity or this transformation is digital identity. And so digital identity is a construct that we believe will realize trillions of dollars in economic growth and value from the security and access or inclusion of billions of people.
Good morning. My name is Jay Reinemann. I'm a partner at a fund called Propel Venture Partners. We're an investor that's focused on early stage technology companies at the intersection of financial services and technology. I've been an investor approximately since about 2000, always in and around this space, and identity's been, from my perspective, a core component to think about as we invest in companies that are both needing identity services and or are providing identity services.
Good, thank you, gentlemen. Whenever I think about a new space, in an investment point of view, I try to ask myself very simple questions, and I'll try to ask these very simple questions to the four of you, right? So in a particular order, I have a why, I have a when, I have a how, I have a where, and I have a whom. I'll start with the easiest. Why in the heck do the four of you want to invest and are interested in the identity space and in digital identities? Who would like to start? Okay, Jay, given that you're the last one coming in, I'll pick on you.
I kind of, as I was alluding to in my introduction, I think just identity is such a core component of being able to deliver, and from my perspective, financial services, but not only that, of course, it's utilities. And if you want a phone these days, you can't even really get that unless you have a very limited service. It's the way that financial services are priced. It's a core component of fraud. Even from a governmental perspective, I think taxation requires identity, and if you want infrastructure, that requires taxation. So if you want business, you want police, you need the tax, and you need the infrastructure so the businesses will feel comfortable in building or investing in your country. All of this, again, is underpinned by the need of really perfect identity. So from my perspective, identity still continues to be a big problem. I think last year, just on the fraud and identity theft perspective, the numbers surprisingly they went up last year to 16 billion in losses, up from 2015, which is amazing. That's like the market cap of Equifax. which says something about maybe those guys aren't doing so good. Or, sorry, anyone from Equifax, same thing with all the others. But I think there's a big opportunity. Perfect identities, I don't know if it's possible, but I think there's definitely a cat and mouse game out there that from an investor perspective, there's opportunity to make some money because there's still a problem.
For me, part of the why is that it's a really large addressable market, right? Everybody has an identity. Most people have multiple identities. So typically when people talk about venture capital, they're always looking for incredibly large markets. And so I think identity is a really large space. I think it's always interesting to hear how people think about, some people say, is identity an asset class? Is identity a sector? What really is it? I think it's not really an industry in the way it's kind of traditionally defined. But what I would say is that every network-based service, and that's things like communications, financial services, healthcare, just to name three, all require some construct or notion of identity as part of their service delivery model. So you've got large user base, incredibly large sectors of the economy that are all being kind of changed or catalyzed or disrupted or transformed to some extent by kind of several of today's prevailing technology themes. And those are things like the proliferation of mobile devices, the amount of personal data we produce as a result. You're also seeing a lot of companies here talking about machine learning or artificial intelligence, which is a way that we can basically produce more valuable insights that can then improve service delivery. And then there's also distributed ledger and blockchain. And so to me, identity is a very interesting way to kind of cut across several big sectors of the global economy and then also gain exposure to several of the interesting sort of technology themes of today.
Yeah, for us, that's our main focus is really identity-related poverty and also anything related to sustainable development goals. And when we just look at the whole world population, that's around 2 billion people who don't have proper economic identity, which will actually have contribute to their lack of access to energy, basic service, healthcare, and everything else, which are extremely important for the long-term growth of the whole world. And when you just look at some examples like healthcare, that if they have a proper identity solution, then they can really just help them to just bring the insurance, bring the Medicare, bring the all different components together. Then they can just help them to just live a better life. And another small example is that when I was traveling in Africa, and I was bullied by a policeman, and who just because I look different from the local people, then they just come and get my passport and say that basically ask me for extra money, and I don't know whether I should give him my document or not. But later that I just get myself out. But later I told my friend who are as the government official there that if the policeman who has a digital identity as a foreigner, that if we can scan their identity, we know that they are really the real one. Then as a foreigner, I feel much safer to just travel. And this apply to this African country, apply to many countries. And also that's why identity is really the basic for many of the service that we as a human being or individuals will receive. And it's very important for especially the marginalized people. Thank you.
Are you going to say no, it's not interesting?
No, I actually think it is very interesting, and I'll expand it a little bit because it's at the heart of every contracting and every relationship we establish with anyone, whether that is a personal relationship, whether it is meeting the significant other, whether it is doing a business transaction, etc. Identity is at the heart of every contract we make. So from that perspective, a lot of trade, commerce, a lot of human activity is potentially impeded by lack of access to this identity infrastructure or the lack of clarity of that identity infrastructure. That's our interest. That's why we're interested.
I'm going to play devil's advocate. What I've heard from the four of you, I believe, unequivocally, is that identity is extremely important for commerce. It's extremely important for individuals for a variety of reasons. What I have not necessarily heard is why is it an interesting investment opportunity, right? And so, in playing devil's advocate, I'm going to use a couple of examples or a couple of points, right? As an investor, I usually shy away from solutions that require a lot of collaboration from various stakeholders. Some of them being governmental agencies, some of them being regulators, some of them being not-for-profit organizations, standards building organizations, and so on and so forth. Especially when these solutions need a holistic approach, right? You don't have point solutions that are silver bullets that will solve identity. So again, I'm going to reiterate my why, based on the fact that it is indeed extremely important for individuals and corporates. Why is it that venture investors would want to invest in something so complex and so risky, especially at this time where presumably there's a lot of infrastructure that is still built?
Well, we divide the business opportunity into two buckets. The one that is dependent on, as you said, on regulators, governments applying a certain role, whether an enforcement role, whether it is a market creation role, whatever it may be. In those cases, we are part of the World Bank, so we are not really staying away from it, but we are cautious as to what the private opportunity is. We have done a couple of instances, very, very few instances, where we have invested in the form of BOT, in the build, operate, transfer, together with the government to build a national identity system. Those are, you're helping the business of the government. That's very simple. It's exitable for us. It's also profitable, but it's not the kind of venture deals that we are looking for and maybe the audience is waiting to hear for. And then the other bucket is the bucket where of the kind of companies that can mine identity. As we enter the digital world, we are creating, we are leaving traces on a day-to-day basis. And the companies that are not building identity, but actually identifying or creating the identity based on all the digital traces that we leave on a day-to-day basis could be companies that we would be interested in because they don't have this dependency on regulators or governments, etc. They mine what's already there. They don't need to create the ecosystem.
Yeah, and for us, that when we just look at deals, then the three components are very important. One is technology, the second is the team, the third is market. And we just start from the market that, if we say that 2 billion people need identity and the market potential is big enough. And also when you just look at a team, and as the distributed ledger technology in general as its early stage, if from the identity solution that you find the right team to invest, and then they can do identity-related solution, they can also just build on this to do much more than that. And the third part is when you just also look at the technology itself, that from the different like blockchain-based or distributed ledger-based technologies, they can go from very different track. And from what we can see that if now you just invest in different solutions, you can also just follow the different track and then to see which one really just emerge as the mainstream one. And the last one is that, from the name of our company, you can see that FinTech for good. So for the for good part is that a must. We have to invest the for good technology. We have our LP and investors or partners who are more patient than the normal VCs.
I think just one point that I would respond to a little bit is kind of the importance of maybe thinking about government a little differently, early stage and identity. I think any early stage business requires some sort of really strong or anchor tenant or collaborating party, whether that's your customer base, other service partners, whatever it is. And so I think that instead of thinking maybe the way typical in Silicon Valley, the mantra of move fast and break things, or break laws or not laws, sorry. Maybe move. Well,
Edit.
Yeah. That's more like don't take a more antagonistic approach to regulators is really what I should say. That actually you need to think about an identity for certain companies. You need to think about government as a partner, and they can be a partner or a collaborating partner that can support and accelerate the development of your business through distribution or whatever it is, or as they can credentialize you and give you a seal of approval that can maybe be a differentiating factor. And so I just think depending on what part of the kind of identity stack or part of the ecosystem you're playing in, it just means that you should think about government a little differently.
Are you gentlemen familiar with what is happening in Scandinavia with open bank ID in Sweden, in Norway, and in Denmark? I would make the parallel, the early days of the internet, where one should not necessarily invest in the core infrastructure, i.e., like building and developing TCP/IP or HTTPS and so on and so forth, right? But you wait for all of that to work out and be developed, and then you start investing in business use cases. That might be different if your investment paradigm is more than just being a pure greedy venture capitalist, right? So I get back to Scandinavia, where all the banks in each of these countries have gathered and collaborate to come up with the building block and the rails, right? And that I don't view as investable from my point of view, but maybe I have a specific approach. But then you have an infinity of use cases that can be built on that. Is that what I'm hearing? Implicitly from what you're saying.
I would agree, and even like that type of infrastructure, even if it was corporate collusion or cooperation, I wouldn't want to do that either. It's more so in the areas where there is a clear business case, where they're on top of these other services. So for us, it's trying to find places where you're trying to implement those solutions. Even in the U.S., where we have like the KYC processes, there's a very clear requirement of what you need to gather, but it's a very unclear way of doing it. So there's good, better, and best ways so far out there, and I think we'd like to try to invest in the ones that can be the best, that then are able to enable the services to lower their fraud or bring on more customers. Oftentimes, I like the more customers even better than reduce fraud. But not, I would agree. It's not the core infrastructure that I don't think it's possible right now in these days. Years ago, investing in things like VeriSign or something like that was possible, but now I think it's tough.
David, would you agree with that as a pure greedy capitalist?
Yeah, I think so. Look, I think just broadly speaking, certain things that are more, I think what you're talking about is the difference of utility, services that are more utility-based versus something that's a little bit more discrete good. And I think utilities are certainly going to be the purview of more established institutions than necessarily a startup.
Maybe I'll enter into your what in the process of answering that. But we define identity as who a person actually is, and then who a person is known to be. So who a person actually is, it is whatever the mom and dad gave birth to. There's nothing we can change about that. Is the DNA, is the uniqueness of that individual. And who that person is known to be is all the labels that we put on that person on a day-to-day basis as that person is known by the ecosystem of humans that surround them. And that ecosystem includes the government. The government says you are citizen number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, born in this date, and that is identity in the eyes of government. But in identity, in my eyes, is the person I grew up with, playing games with, or the person I got married to. That is the identity the way I place it. And as the world gets to know us, we have so many labels that surround us. You are 6 foot tall, you are white, you are whatever it is, all the labels that surround us. And as that data gets distributed in many, many parts of the digital ecosystem, then the businesses to invest in is those businesses that can put the puzzle back together. The businesses that play not in the core, not in the first label of identity, but in many labels of identity. And that is the angle that we are taking for the moment.
Yeah, for us, when we just look, I want to bring back to do good deals that can be sexy, and it's not necessarily to be really just as not for profit or that. I'll give you an example that when we have a pilot project in an African country to develop the education identity or certification identity for individuals after they receive training, and when we look at anyone in that country who will receive training and then to change all the certification system. And from each of the system that when you look at this deal, that they use this, and then from the employer perspective, then they can just scan the certification, the identity. They know that what kind of education or certificate they got, and then they are more safe to just make the decision. From the individual or learner side, that then their learning becoming incentivized. Then when you look at the potential size of this and the population who will receive certificates from this country, and it's enormous. It's an enormous business opportunity. And when that is tested in one African country, can be applied in many. And that's actually just for this one company, one deal can just have a big, enormous opportunity. So that is actually a good deal, sexy deal.
Actually, I like that chain of thinking, right? So to me, there are two types of countries: the countries that do not have a national identity scheme in real life, physical life, and those that do. So from an investment perspective, does it mean that it's easier and more interesting to invest in the identity space in countries that already have a national identity scheme, on the basis or the assumption that it's going to be easier to do a digital bridge, to new forms of identities, i.e., Indonesia or India or Scandinavia? Or is it easier to play in the gaps in the US, for example, that doesn't have a national identity scheme because it's a greenfield opportunity? And you invest in emerging countries. The two of you invest in the US? Or
Yes, US, UK, and actually
US,
one
UK.
investment that's New York based, but they're more focused on.
So am I
markets.
thinking about it in the wrong way? Are they, is the where extremely important contextually?
Certainly contextually, yeah. I mean, you're going to think about things very differently. We've invested in a company that's using deep learning and neural network to use a camera phone to do biometric recognition. So they can do both registration and then authentication. And so that's something that they're really focused on, markets that have really poorly developed infrastructure, and creating this very basic identity scheme can be kind of disruptive and really enable, accelerate the development of kind of like basic services, social welfare aid. I don't think that's something, if their go-to-market strategy was based on the U.S., I would be pretty skeptical of an investment like that. I mean, I don't think people want to be, waving their hands in front of cameras every time they get something to eat or receive medical care here. I don't think that's something that's that palatable here. But in the developing world, that can be a pretty impactful thing if that's going to accelerate this. Sorry. So
We usually like to invest in the areas including the geographies where we know something. So, like, I would need an Andi or somebody to tell me this is a good deal, because in this local market, because otherwise I'll never understand it enough.
Well, but I mean, that's a fair point. But let's suspend disbelief for a second, and follow me in the. Let's assume that the U.S. has a national identity system in place, physical, federal, right? Not at the state level. Would that facilitate your investment thesis in the digital identity space or not?
I don't know if it would make much of a difference, just because I think I'm usually investing in the things where there's a bad guy on the other side.
Mhm.
And as long as there's a bad guy, they're always going to try to find their ways around how to falsify or steal that identity to use it for something. And regardless of if there's a national ID system in place or not, I think that's still a fundamental problem.
just one other comment I would add is one of the ways I think about identity is that the developed world, the focus is much more on security, and the developing world is much more about access or inclusion. And so I think that you kind of need a slightly different investment thesis, or your checklist about how you analyze an investment is going to be different under those two paradigms.
Yeah, and so basically, the nature of the problem decides that whether which kind of a solution should be there for that problem. And if they, for any country which has existing identity system, and again, digital identity just can be a supporting identity system for those which the formal one cannot provide. And for those ones which don't have any of those, and of course, to build from scratch, and then that's the conversation with the government could be really extremely important and useful, meaning that how to just no matter the country has or has not, and the identity-related problems are there, and the solution which you want to bring to that market is that how this can just solve the problem in that market.
A lot of our thinking on identity is legally defined, but we should look beyond the world of law and regulation as to what identity is. So, for example, the needs of Airbnb in identifying a host would be very different from the need of a border control in identifying an individual that comes into the country. So Airbnb may be only interested to make sure that the host will be hosting a family or a young person or a vulnerable person, make sure that they're not the rapist, they're not the criminal, etc. So identity for them is very different. So I would say from a business case perspective, it is much easier to invest in an identity company that sits on top of existing infrastructure than something that needs to start that infrastructure.
And from that same token, are you more excited about direct-to-consumer model or B2B models? From
B2B.
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 Everyone is.
Yeah, same for me. I think consumers are still, while LifeLock seems to be an anomaly, and some of the credit bureau services also, I think consumers still aren't ready to pay for protection.
Is that the same?
I would agree with that. Yeah, we are looking at the 2C as early stage, but we are more through the incubation side.
From the incubation side, yeah. I'm going to take a counterpoint again on what you just said. So maybe it's the idealist in me, right? So every time I think about identity or identity scheme or digital identities, actually think equally about privacy, right? And how to protect people's privacy. I think that we probably need equally so, even more so, privacy schemes, right? When we talk about digital identities, and when we think about privacy schemes, we think about individuals. Facebook or Airbnb is not necessarily interested in our individual privacy. They're interested in monetizing any type of data that they can leverage off of us. And strangely, I haven't heard the words privacy. I mean, I think that you were close to saying so. And maybe you haven't encountered that in startups that you look at that you can potentially invest in, or am I wrong?
We're an investor in a company called Brave, which is an interesting. It's a browser. It's the founder is the same guy that built Mozilla and one of the early engineers at Netscape, Firefox. Now he's got this thing called Brave, which they're selling it as a very private and secure browser and very fast for any. And it's still in public beta. It's going to launch pretty soon, and they're going to do. We can have a whole other conversation about the ICO that they're going to be doing, but the underlying thesis of it is that the existing browser, the online advertising world is very broken. If it was just if it was just a publisher and an advertiser and nobody in between, I think we'd be all right. But it's all those guys in the middle, the middlemen, the ad servers, the guys that are stealing your identity, and oftentimes using it for things and injecting malware through advertising. So I think it comes down to privacy and what these guys are trying to do. And they're doing it and they're not selling a privacy service, but they're doing it in a sort of a backwards way, where they're enabling you to control your identity and offer it to the advertisers that you want to, and then also you get paid for that. You get a piece of the money. So it was an acceptable one for us because it wasn't requiring the consumer to pay. They pay with their attention, basically. And that's the currency that's being used versus hard dollars or Ether or Bitcoin.
Any more takers on my privacy angle in investing in privacy, meaning developing identity schemes in the same?
Right. Well, I mean, I think it just the point that came to mind for me is a lot of times action is going to be driven by who's more directly bearing the cost of these things. And I think privacy at a consumer or individual level, I think we suspect it, we know it, but it's hard to attribute a cost to it per se. Like, I don't know what my privacy is actually worth, and it would be hard for me to come up with an estimate of it. I know that it's meaningful and it's important, but really putting a discrete value on it is challenging. But when you see privacy violations, a lot of times the violations, that cost is being directly borne by businesses. And so I almost think of it in that sort of a B2B2C framework or context, which is that it's a problem for me as an individual, but potentially privacy of the individual is going to be more solved by people who, from a legal framework, are directly bearing that cost.
Yeah, and so for we work with a few companies, which one is, for example, VIX. That's the founder of that. He is a cybersecurity like a professional or expertise, and all the ledger which he developed is really just taking that as the most serious thing. The second is it's called this ledger. And where that's from the open ledger that everyone can see the transaction, everything, which for many of the big like financial institutions, it could be problematic. And then this ledger is just really P2P, and then others cannot really see it. And then from another, it's like a very early stage hackathon result is called a house passport, where that you gain back your data autonomy, that you only own your data, and others the first use case of that is if it's for emergency medical doctor who want to save your life, then they can scan your house passport, then get only those information relevant to save your life. All the other information still belong to you, and no one else can just use your data to do anything else. So actually, blockchain or distributed ledger can help you to gain back that autonomy. Yeah.
I take a very different perspective. I actually think that the topic is privacy versus security, but privacy is gone. So for all practical purposes, we will soon live in a world where nothing is private. And to make that argument, I won't look at 5 years or 10 years. I'll look at 2,000, 3,000 years of human history and where we've gone from 2,000 years ago, where nobody knew who lived in the cave next door, to now where we know who lives in Beijing. And we ourselves disclose quite a bit of information. We have digital or leave digital traces everywhere we go. We map ourselves every second in every part of the world. So therefore, we're volunteering a lot of information, and a lot of that information is being stocked. Again, 1,000 years ago or 100 years ago, it was all in the memory of humans. A human died, that whole stock of identity information is gone with them. Now we store it. We store it all the time, constantly, without any issue of space. So slowly, we're building histories on everything around us, our own identity, that will always be there forever, for thousands of years to be mined, and for that privacy that we thought we had to actually be an illusion.
Is that a World Bank official line?
It's a reality line. For me, it's a reality line, and then the question becomes, how do you secure against it? Rather than fight privacy, deal with security.
That elicits to me like if there's an entrepreneur in the room here, I'd love to talk to that person and say, let's come up with a business model that allows for biodegradable data. And so I have the ability to figure out when I can biodegrade the data that I want to biodegrade, because that to me doesn't resonate very well with my idealistic vision of where Mindcan should go.
Sort of an OTP for data? An OTP, a one-time password for data?
Hey, we're have another 5 or 6 minutes before we open it to questions to the audience. Any particular theme or any particular startup, and maybe you can't give the name of the startup, but you could like describe in meta terms that startup that interests you and excites you right now in the space that you would readily invest in.
I have a question for the panel in a way, or for anyone around the world of identity.
It's going to cost you.
The
role, the questions.
Is the role of the big boys in identity. So the role of Facebook, the role of Apple, the role of the big data companies, or call them network companies, call them whatever you want to call it, or Google, because it looks to me more and more obvious that they know more about us than anybody else. And then, A, what is the investment thesis in that context, which is not apparent to me? And then B, what is the role of those giants in the world of identity going forward, and whether they have solutions that we can only dream of. But I don't know enough about what these guys are doing under the table, except for I know I'm giving my fingerprint to Apple all the time, and my password and everything else.
Yeah, and just yesterday, I had a whole day, 14 hours meeting with the Chinese investors, looking at all the deals that from the, some come from outside of DC and most from the DC metropolitan area. That we were very excited to. I already mentioned several like this ledger, like bigs, like banking and others, and they are the most exciting part that some are at the infrastructure level, and where that they really don't follow the existing as like a Bitcoin based or Ethereum, and then they are looking at a different ledgers. And secondly, that from the problem they address, and they are not addressing the typical financial related issues. They are looking at the energy sector and other more non-financial sector, which I think have much better or bigger potential application for the technology for the as a solution for the future problems. Yeah.
Any
I mean,
models, themes that are exciting?
Yeah, no. So I think one theme that, or one thing that I'm focused on is really, at least on the financial services side, is interesting startups that are figuring out how to kind of break the way identity works in developed markets, where existing financial institutions are really kind of the gatekeepers or the onboarding ramps for your financial identity, and so there's a large set of people out there who just aren't very well served. Because banks aren't KYCing them or serving them. And from an innovator's dilemma perspective, I think it gets a little oversimplified sometimes into simply that large bureaucracies are bad at innovation. But really what it says is, why is it, it's really much more about why is it that customer bases that aren't served or their needs aren't met, why is it that companies or products launched to go after kind of the underserved can over time kind of subsume or take over the much larger market? So I actually think there are interesting opportunities to do very disruptive things in payments and banking by delivering sort of for-profit enterprise models going after the underserved or unserved.
I was mostly thinking about Andy's comment about like the big guys in Apple, and I think we kind of got a warning signal with that Yahoo breach. But what would happen if we saw the same size or bigger breach, much bigger, with a Google or Facebook? And the PII, the credentials that are being used to log into so many other places, or someone like Yodely being finally hacked, and just the massive scale that would problem that would cause. So I hope those companies are investing tremendous amount of resources in authentication and security.
Biodegradable data, the right to be
That's
forgotten.
the one.
That's like a huge business. All right, we have a few more minutes for questions from the audience. If we haven't bored you to death and you're all asleep. Yes.
So this takes a little bit of background because a lot of people younger than me, but you remember the day between the fight between Betamax and VHS. Right? And so Betamax wanted to be the king of the video market, and so Betamax were only on Sony machines. VHS were some many manufacturers. VHS won out. Here I come and see like over 200 companies in the identity space, identity management, fraud, security, all these different sectors. Two things. One, don't you think identity itself is the business? And secondly, rather than investing in hundreds of potential companies, shouldn't you invest in a platform like a VHS, a video machine, or a platform basically, that can work with every solution out there that is trustworthy?
If life could be so simple.
No, it really is. If you would let people identify themselves, which they don't now in today's enterprise.
It's just it's one of those chicken and egg. It's the poultry problem though with those kinds of things. Like you need the adoption on both sides to create the value, and unless you have some sort of inherently differential technology or support that's somewhat unnatural from government or something, I think it's a lot of work to get the both ends to build up.
Yeah, and that's why for ledgers in general, for me, it's more interesting than the application itself. For the ledger, that's you choose ledger, you choose technology path, and you choose actually the platform where that everything can be built up. And if you choose just an application, this may not work in another situation, and that's I think that is the type of way how I look at it.
I think we have another question over there.
Yes, good morning. So to your question about biodegradable data, I like the concept. However, you could potentially do that today using something like a blockchain or smart contract, right? Some sort of business rule that says 6 months after I expire, my data gets overwritten. Anybody want to take up on that? Any investors I got up here that want
I'll
to?
take on that.
All right.
The question is, how do you get everybody on the planet to agree with it?
Agreed.
Because
I mean, this
I
is,
have data on you, so does Google, so does Yahoo, so does
you
Amazon.
want to talk to that gentleman to your
So
right.
how do you do that?
So my question, I just had to address that particular concept. My question had to do, again, from the investor perspective, which industries specifically do you see more advanced in trying to address these concepts of privacy and identity, exclusive of FinTech? And which one do you think probably has the most growth potential or advancement potential across the globe?
Volunteer healthcare,
Yeah, and the education.
e-commerce.
I wanted to say FinTech, but you said I
Yes,
couldn't.
no.
So,
That's too easy.
look, I mean, I think that the three healthcare, financial services, it'll be interesting to see what happens in communications. And I mostly just say that just from a standpoint of I see you cock your head there a little bit to see.
Communication, what-
I think for privacy of communications. I mean, so communications and identity communications is a big problem right now. I mean, I think you can look at several of the largest data breaches, whether that's Sony or what happened in our most recent election. Those are actually fundamentally identity problems, right? So I think that's an area where I'm looking at what's happening in communications. It's not necessarily from from the infrastructure per se, but are there different schema that people are looking at or thinking about when you talk about specifically with respect to like authentication, really, is how can you do authentication in a manner that's private and secure? How do you strike that balance?
One last question. I'm sorry, there was a gentleman who was ahead of you.
So there wasn't that much talk about interoperability, and how do you see that could solve a lot of the problems of what blockchain do we choose and what technology base do we use, and then how can that actually communicate with other solutions, because it's very likely that there is going to be Betamaxes and VHSs and a lot more in the coming years because it's a global problem that many companies are trying to solve. And what do you see there as of like how to build business models for interoperable solutions that will happen and have to happen to actually create a proper digital ID that can accessible globally?
That's excellent.
Yeah, and just 2 weeks ago, we launched a Smart City Blockchain Lab. And I think to just have a comprehensive kind of a solution that you need to have a container or the test base where everything should happen, need to happen. And the reason for us to launch that is that, by 2030, that there will be more than 500 billion IoT devices will be connected. And then there will be a lot of individuals live in this digital world in the smart city. And then there's education happening and the infrastructure happening all in this. So if you just put the government back up the smart city and then combine all the different technologies, have all the problem identified, then using blockchain as one of the offer to the smart city, and then you can actually just really using the technology to cross all sectors to just address the same issue under the smart city umbrella. So that is, definitely one of the way to address this interoperability. Yeah.
One last response to, if anyone wants to.
I was trying to remember the name. There was a recent ICO that was trying to address blockchain interoperability. Extremely successful. It sold out in like 15 minutes. Anybody know the name of that one? No.
Ponzi?
Let's
I don't know.
hope not.
All right.
Yeah.
I think our time is up. We could have taken another 10, 15 minutes, I'm sure, or even an hour. But thank you very much for attending. And thank you.